Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? So for this project I want to make a bench for our front hallway. And I've got this beautiful piece of walnut. It's 8/4 thick and 12 inches wide, so perfect for a bench. I hate to cut it, but it really will be ideal for this purpose. And then I've got this birdseye maple, and I'm going to glue this together into larger panels to form the legs. So let's get started. So I've got two pieces of birdseye maple. One of them is really flat and has really nice bird's eye markings on it. I'm going to use that for the front piece, the front leg, and one of the end legs. Those are more exposed. Then this piece, it's not quite as nice, and it's also got a twist in it. You can see when I push on the ends. So I'm going to use the jointer to flatten that out.
It took about 3 passes on the jointer to get the board flat on the face.
Alright, I've jointed the boards and I'm ready to glue them up. At the start of the video, I made a mistake and I said the bench was going to be 17 inches high. I realized afterward that I really want it to be 18 inches high. And I've cut the boards to be roughly 18 inches. So I'm going to try to line the boards up when I'm gluing them to be as aligned as possible so that I can minimize the amount of waste. I want to get them as close to 18 inches as I can. So I've got 3 boards to glue up. I've got them positioned with the best layout, I think. So before gluing them up, what I'm going to do is use a biscuit joiner to put some biscuits. I'll put 3 biscuits along here. So I'm going to put 3 marks along here for the biscuits. And then I'll get out the biscuit joiner and cut these.
Using the biscuits is nice because it helps to keep everything in alignment, and that's particularly important when gluing and clamping. After clamping, I wipe the board down with a damp rag because it's a lot easier to clean up the glue now before it hardens. And there are the boards all clamped up. I let them set overnight and now I'm unclamping them.
So I cut the walnut with a skill saw off camera, and it's 36 inches long. That's the size of the bench that I'm going to make. And it's very flat. It's a very flat piece of wood. So I'm going to simply run it through the drum sander to clean it up on both sides.
The walnut was about 2 1/4 inches thick, so that was my starting point on the drum sander. The drum sander is not a high-speed machine. I've actually doubled the video speed here, just so that it won't be quite so slow. It took multiple passes, going down a very small increment every time. And now with so much surface area going through the sander, I've actually increased the video speed by 5 times. And now I'm trimming the legs to the proper width. 2 of the legs are 15 inches wide and the other 2 legs are about 7 inches wide. And now with the stop block, I want to make sure that I cut all of the legs to be exactly the same length. And I was able to cut them to be about 17 3/4 inches long, almost the 18 inches that I wanted. And now with the legs cut, I've just placed them on the walnut, on the underside of the walnut, just to get an idea of what it's going to look like. The next thing I need to do is cut slots in the walnut so the legs can be fitted inside. So I'm going to mark the positions of the legs using a scrap piece of wood as a spacer, and I've got a white pencil that I'm using to trace the outside edge of each of the legs. And now I'm going to cut the slot on the bandsaw. I'm using a fence so that I have a nice straight line, and I'm going to cut all the left side cuts first with the fence in the same position for all the cuts. Before making the cut on the right-hand side, I'm making a test cut in a piece of MDF. That way I can fit the leg into the slot to make sure that it's the right width. And it ended up being a pretty good fit. I had to tap over the fence just a hair to make the slot a little bit bigger, but just a hair. After making the left cut and the right cut, I'll cut down the middle to remove the bulk of the wood and leave just a small portion of the wood at the end that I will cut out using a chisel. And now I'm just doing a test fit. Before doing the chiseling, I want to make sure that the slots are the right size so that the wood fits tightly but not too tight. And it was actually a very good fit. One of the pieces, this piece that I'm trying to insert now, was just a little bit too tight, but I fixed that up with a chisel. It wasn't nearly as difficult to remove these pieces with a chisel as I thought it was going to be. It just took a little bit of patience, but I ended up with a very clean cut. And here I'm just gently trimming down the side to make the fit a little bit looser for the one leg that was a little bit tight fitting. And now it slides in really nicely. And here's the bench with a dry fit. The legs are inserted, but they're not glued. There are two things remaining to do before I glue the legs in. One is I need to cut or drill the holes for the dowels that are going to be inserted to hold the top in place. I don't want to rely just on glue. I've inserted a piece of scrap wood into the slot for the leg just so there's no tear out when the drill goes through the piece of walnut. And now I'm using a round over bit to have a nice rounded, smooth edge all the way around the top of the bench. Here I'm doing a little bit of a climb cut just near the edge of the end grains to make sure that I don't have any tear out, and then I'm coming back in the proper direction. The last thing to do before gluing up the legs is to cut a bevel on the underside of the bench all the way around. And you can see that I've inserted some blocks of wood, some scrap pieces of wood into the slots that are intended for the legs, and that's just to make sure that the pieces of wood don't move when they're running against the fence, and more importantly, on the end grain it's pretty brittle, so I want to make sure that it doesn't snap off. So I'm cutting a 30-degree bevel here. I'm actually on a collision course with the miter gauge, but luckily I noticed it in time, so I turned off the saw and I adjusted the position of the fence just by loosening a couple of nuts, and then I started back up. And now it's ready to be glued up. Now, because the legs are all exactly the same length, it's very important that they don't push through the top and extend up past the surface of the top. Otherwise, I'm going to have some wobble when I put the legs on the ground. So I've set this on the table saw, which is a nice flat surface, and I'm tapping the legs all the way down to be in contact with the surface of the table saw. And that will help to ensure that the legs are extending down exactly the same length. When I cut the bevels, I saved the pieces to help with the clamping. So I'm just going to attach these loosely with the dowels that I'm going to insert later, just to hold them in place, and then I can attach the clamps to the outside. I left it clamped overnight, and the next morning it was time to sand the epoxy that I had applied around the outside edge of the legs just to fill any gaps that might exist. There really weren't very many gaps, but it did clean it up and make it look nice. And I'm just putting one more coat of epoxy just to fill any little remaining gaps. I had already drilled the holes for the dowels when I had a flat surface on the edge of the walnut. So now I'm drilling through the maple. It would be more difficult now because it's a beveled surface, but I'm just reusing the holes that I already drilled. And now I'm putting a little bit of glue into each hole, and then I will tap the dowels all the way through. And I'm using a Japanese flush cut saw to remove the excess dowel. And then I'll sand it and then apply a few coats of finish. I started using a flat finish, but I ended up changing my mind and using a semi-gloss polyurethane. I applied 3 coats and then rubbed it with pumice stone and oil, and then I applied a coat of paste wax. Our dog, Winnie, loves the bench, but my wife doesn't. She thinks it's too modern for our house. So now I gotta buy a new house. So I gotta ask, would you make it?